there. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to conduct a two-way chi-square test in SPSS. So as you may recall, anytime we are conducting a chi-square test, whether a one-way or a two-way, we are dealing exclusively with categorical variables. And those are variables that, shockingly enough, are comprised of categories, right? So for example, we might code alcohol use as yes or no. That would be a categorical variable, or political affiliation as Republican, Democrat, independent. We might code gender as male, female, or non-binary, right? We might, again, look at whether or not you've joined a sorority, and that would just be yes or no, or do you smoke, and that could be yes or no. So again, it's just categorical levels that are not in any way related to quantity or magnitude or any sort of numerical component. So specifically with the two-way chi-square, essentially what we're trying to do is determine whether there is a potential relationship between two categorical variables. Right? So most of the time we are looking to see whether the percentages we find in one group differ significantly from the percentages that we find in another group. Right? So just like with continuous variables, we might look at two different means and conduct a test to see if they're significantly different from each other. With categorical variables, because we don't have any sort of numeric quantity, we can't use a mathematical formula to tell us to describe our variables. So instead, we have to rely on percentages, right? So again, what we're looking for with a two-way chi-square test is we're looking to see if the frequencies or percentages in one group in our sample differ significantly from the percentages or frequencies of another group in our sample, right? So for this particular exercise or tutorial that I'm going to walk you through, we are going to be working with the same data set that we worked with in my last video talking about one-way chi-squares in SPSS. So we're going to work with the ASH data set, and we're going to test Dr. Mori's hypothesis that there's a significant relationship between gender and one's likelihood to conform. Right? So specifically, Dr. Mori is hypothesizing that females will be more likely to conform at least once than males. Okay, so that is Dr. Mori's hypothesis is the alternative hypothesis or the research hypothesis. Okay, so if that is the research hypothesis, what is the null hypothesis? Right? Well, the null hypothesis is that the groups will be equal. Okay, so the likelihood to conform in males will be equal to that in females. Okay, so again, that's not always the case depending upon the data set and the particular hypotheses being tested and the knowledge that we have about the data set, right? It might be different. So it might not be 50%. Like last week, our null hypothesis was that we would find the same results as Solomon Ash. So one percentage we expected to be 75%. So we expected 75 people to conform at least once and 25% not to conform. So it's not always set at 50%. but in many of the examples I've gone through, the null hypothesis is that the groups will be equal, which is depending upon how many categories you have, often 50%. If we have a dichotomous category, right, then the expected percentage would be 50% if there's only 2 levels. But if we had a category with 3 levels, then the expected percent would be 33%, right? So it just depends what specific hypotheses make up the research question and the null. So it really just depends on the example. But in this case, our null hypothesis is that the categories will be equal. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see my SPSS. All right, so I have my ASH data set, Dr. Mori's data set pulled up here. And again, we're wanting to conduct a 2-way chi-square test. So how do we do that? Well, first we're going to go to Analyze. And then we're going to go down here to Descriptive Statistics. And then we're going to go to Crosstabs. Okay, so Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, Crosstabs. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and click Crosstabs. And the thing to remember when you are inputting your variables, your categorical variables for SPSS to make this calculation, is that you want to put your independent variable in the rows column and your dependent variable, excuse me, in the columns column, right? So what is our independent variable here? Well, the groups that we are looking at, the 2 groups that we are examining are males and females. So this is more of a quasi independent variable, right? Because we're not actively manipulating this variable. But it is like I said, the levels that we are examining in reference to our dependent variable. So we're going to go ahead and put gender in the rows column because it is our quasi-independent variable. And then we're going to go ahead and put our dependent variable, which is did participants conform at least once? And we're going to go ahead and put that in the columns category. Okay. So again, gender makes up the different groups that we'll be looking at in our sample. So that would be our quasi-independent variable. And because the outcome that we're interested in is whether they conformed at least once or not, that is our dependent variable. Okay? Or our outcome measure is another way of thinking about that. So again, in the rows column, we have our independent variable, and in the columns box, we have our dependent variable, which is, did they conform at least once? Yes or no? Okay. But we're not done yet. We still have to give SPSS some information. So we're going to go to Statistics, and we're going to tell SPSS the type of test that we want to calculate. So we're going to select chi-square here. Okay. And then we're going to select Continue. Okay. And then we are going to click Cells, which is just below Statistics. Okay. And we're going to tell SPSS to collect percentages in the row box, or from the row box. this, right? Because the row is where our independent variable is. So if we select this, SPSS is going to tell us what percent of males conformed at least once and what percentage of females conformed at least once. And those are the two groups that we want to compare, and also our independent variable. So we want to indicate to SPSS where they should look to give us the percentages that we need, okay? We could also, if we wanted, ask SPSS to give us the expected percentages, right? Which we would need to calculate SPSS or to calculate chi-square by hand. So we can go ahead and select that. And we can also select the adjusted standardized residuals if we wanted to. And that would tell us what our observed minus expected value is, okay? So that would give you what I've selected now. I've selected observed, okay? And I could also select expected, and I would get both percentages. The observed would reflect what we found, and the expected would reflect what we predicted in the null hypothesis, right? Which is 50% males, 50% females. And then if I also wanted to, like I said, I could select adjusted standardized residuals here, and that would tell me, then I would have not just the observed percentages and the expected percentages, I would also have the O minus E column in our table. We don't necessarily need that. SPSS doesn't need that. But if you wanted to check your work, for example, when you're doing a problem by hand, you could use SPSS to make sure that the values in your table are correct and that your observed and expected percentages are correct, right? But for our purposes, I'm just going to go ahead and select observed row percentages, and that's all we need, okay? So make sure before you hit OK, all right, that you have selected chi-square test under statistics, and that you have selected observed and specifically row under percentages, okay? Because that's going to give you the information that you need. Okay, so what is our output here? What do we have in front of us? Well, let's go to gender of participant, the first table here. Gender of participant times that little asterisk. Did subject conform at least once? Okay, so what do we have here? Well, in the total column, that's going to tell us the total number of participants who are males, okay, and the total number of participants who are female. Okay. And over here, that's going to tell us the number of participants who conformed and the number of participants who did not conform. Okay, so we had 67 out of 100 males who conformed at least once, or 67%, which we see here. And then we had 33 males out of 100 who did not conform, which is 33%. Okay, so that's what you see here, is the raw number of individuals in each category out of 100. And then we have the same thing for females. So 76 out of 100 females did conform at least once, and 24 out of 100 females did not. Okay, and again, that corresponds to 76% and 24%. Okay. So just looking at our percentages, right, does it look like Dr. Morey's hypothesis is correct? Or could be correct? Yeah, because if we compare these percentages, 76% of females did conform at least once versus 67 males. 67% of males conformed. So if we compare those descriptive statistics, right, if we compare the percentages, the percent of females who conformed is indeed higher than the percent of males, right? So at least looking at those numbers, it does seem to support Dr. Mori's hypothesis, but critically, in order to reject the null hypothesis that there is an equal percentage, or that the percentage of males who conformed is not significantly different than the percentage of females who conformed, we need to run our chi-square test, right? And if we look over here to Pearson chi-square, that's going to give us our chi-square value, right? And we would round that up to 2 decimal places to 1.99. And our degrees of freedom is 1. And here we have our significance level, right? So it's often called different things depending on the type of test that you're running, but anytime you see significance value, that's going to tell you your p-value, right? So because 0.159 is larger than 0.05, okay, then we must retain the null hypothesis. Okay, so we must conclude that the percentage of females who conformed is not significantly different than the percentage of males who conformed, despite the difference in percentages. Okay. So contrary to Dr. Mori's hypothesis, right? So contrary to Dr. Mori's hypothesis, right, females and males were equally likely to conform, or they weren't significantly different from each other. Okay. All right. So I've showed you how to write those results in APA style. So you can go ahead and look at that example. And I just want to emphasize again that you always want to start with the research hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis. And then from there, you're going to indicate what you found. So you're going to tell me your chi-square value, your degrees of freedom, and your p-value, and whether it's less than or greater than 0.05. And you also want to include your descriptive statistics. So in this case, because we're looking at categorical variables, you want to include your percentages at each level of the category, and you also want to include your sample size, right? So there's a lot that will vary as you're writing your APA style paragraphs in terms of the variables being tested, the type of test that you're conducting, whether it's chi-square, one sample t, or whatever. And of course, the descriptive statistics themselves will change. So it might look like there's not always a lot of uniformity between your APA style results paragraphs, but there actually is an underlying structure. And that underlying structure is that you start with your hypotheses, you then proceed to what you found, you then describe the result of the test in terms of your obtained value, degrees of freedom, and p-value, and then you include your descriptive statistics, whether those are means and standard deviations, or in this case, percentages. And you also want to include your sample size. Okay? All right, so that concludes this video, and of course I will be available during lab today to answer any questions that you might have, and I look forward to seeing you there. All right, guys, I'll see you soon.